The digital pressure monitor on the heavy carbon steel safety line registered exactly 640 pounds per square inch, yet my hands felt cold enough to shatter like liquid nitrogen-cooled glass. The small dashboard clock in my rental vehicle read 7:45 on a freezing Monday morning, exactly 7 days before the massive industrial explosion at a Key Alloys was scheduled to incinerate 22 innocent employees and clear my husband's mounting offshore debts. In my previous life, that precise chemical fire had reduced my skin to unrecognizable black slag, but my second chance did not begin with a miracle, it began with a targeted inspection. I looked down at my long, pale fingers, completely free of the shiny, purple scar tissue that had covered 70% of my body before my heart finally stopped beating in the intensive care unit. For 3 excruciating months in my former life, I had laid in a sterile room listening to the high-pitched hum of the ventilator, watching Sebastian Ose negotiate my $50 million survival trust with our corporate lawyers while his mistress, Octavia Duchamp, pretended to wipe away dry tears. In this life, my father's old company had not yet been fully drained of its capital, and I had returned to Pennsylvania with a commercial certification in high-pressure toxic hazard detection that they never expected me to obtain. I checked the state registry card in my breast pocket, running my thumb over the fresh lamination where my name was listed as the lead compliance officer for the Great Lakes Industrial Assurance Syndicate. If Sebastian or Octavia had spent 10 minutes checking my state credential registration, instead of planning their next tropical vacation on the company ledger, they would have realized that the woman coming to run the hazardous material audit was the same wife they had currently gaslit into staying at a private sanitarium in Maine. Instead, they had spent the entire weekend finalizing the $500 million global comprehensive casualty insurance package that they planned to collect on when the facility turned into a crater. The security gates at the edge of the smelting complex groaned against the bitter December wind, their rusty gears grinding with the familiar metal-on-metal screech that had haunted my dreams during my long months in the hospital burn unit. To my left, a black town car was already parked near the administration block, its engine running silently and sending small wisps of white exhaust into the frozen gray air. Inside that car sat Desmond Thackeray, the chief underwriting specialist representing the international financial group that stood to lose $500 million if my assessment turned out to be inaccurate. I grabbed my leather kit bag from the passenger seat, checked the heavy digital analyzer inside, and stepped out into the biting cold. Every breath I took of the damp, sulfurous air felt like a direct assault on my lungs, reminding me of the night my airway collapsed when the ammonia valves were turned 90 degrees past their limit. In my first life, my family had built this facility from a single-furnace copper casting shop into a triple-threat specialized nickel smelting giant, and they had taught me every single rivet and weld in the process. When my father died 3 years ago, Sebastian Ose had used my grief to sign over the controlling voting shares to his dummy corporation, telling me that a woman with an advanced degree in chemical thermodynamics belonged in a home, not in a muddy hard hat. He had called my intelligence an instability, my vigilance a symptom of paranoid anxiety, and my love for my inheritance an obsession that needed medical treatment. I met Desmond Thackeray by the main security office, his tall figure silhouetted against the bright orange glow of the distant molten furnace number 4. He did not say a word at first, merely looking at me with a pair of intense, dark blue eyes that seemed to take in the quality of my protective gear, my quiet posture, and the way my fingers twitch-tested my analyzer button. I could smell the faint scent of rain and tobacco on his heavy woolen coat, a sharp contrast to the nauseating, oily chemical vapor of the plant that already clung to my hair. "We are 48 hours behind on our underwriting documentation," Desmond said, his voice a deep, flat growl that held no room for pleasantries. "Your regional office indicated that you would require 48 hours of solo structural analysis on the lower toxic transport manifolds before my financial team could issue our preliminary report to the New York Exchange. The main policy will not bind if the ammonia tanks have even a 3% divergence in their pressure maintenance seals," I replied, keeping my tone perfectly professional and completely devoid of any local accent. "We are a full 7 days ahead of your typical binding cycle, because I noticed a dangerous fluctuation in your EPA registry filings from the late quarter of last year." Desmond squinted through the industrial fog toward the tall silver silos of the ammonia recovery sector, his gloved hands sliding into his deep coat pockets. Sebastian Osei assured our global investment committee that those fluctuations were caused by a faulty calibration during a standard state inspector visit. Sebastian Osei lies when his breath is warm, and he lies even faster when there is money on the table, I thought to myself, though I kept my facial muscles perfectly still. Aloud, I only said that calibration records do not explain why 30 tons of industrial coolant were missing from the dry process manifest during my remote check of the interstate transit logs last night. A shadow moved behind the high safety glass windows of the third-floor administrative deck, and for a fraction of a second, the light caught the profile of Sebastian Osei, his expensive silk tie looking entirely out of place in a dirty industrial yard. Next to him, a slender figure in an ivory cashmere coat stood leaning against the steel drawing desk, her fingers casually twirling a yellow plastic stylus. It was Octavia Duchamp, his operational manager, and the woman who would have been wearing my grandmother's diamond engagement ring on her left hand in exactly 2 weeks in my old life. They both looked down at the courtyard, their body language projecting the complete ease of predators who believed their prey was securely locked away 500 miles away. I adjusted my heavy protective goggles, the rubber strap pulling tight against my temple with a small snap that felt like a tiny jolt of adrenaline directly into my brain. The short-term loop was currently running. I had 48 hours to map the physical rigging they had done to the automated bypass lines in the lower dry chambers. The long-term loop was far more delicate. I had to prove that this sabotage was not an accidental design flaw, but a deliberate criminal conspiracy funded by a series of off-the-books bank transfers from Sebastian's private holding company in Delaware. "Let us start with the lower boiler vault," I said, turning to Desmond as my heavy leather boots hit the salt-rimed asphalt of the main walkway. "We should inspect the internal lining before the morning shifts begin their thermal charging sequence at 9 o'clock. Desmond Thackeray nodded once, a brief, silent gesture of agreement, and followed me down the steep concrete steps into the subterranean wet treatment corridor. As the heavy steel pressure door closed behind us, cutting off the pale winter light of Erie, Pennsylvania, my heart hammered against my ribs with the dull, thudding rhythm of an old boiler near its maximum capacity. The basement corridor of the wet treatment block was narrower than I remembered from my childhood, its walls covered in thick layers of peeling yellow epoxy and heavy pipelines wrapped in white mineral wool insulation. In my past life, this was the exact location where the gas pocket had initially accumulated after the pressure seal on line 6 was manually loosened by 45 degrees. My skin grew warm beneath my winter jacket, a phantom heat that felt like a box of matches being struck simultaneously inside my muscle tissue. I remembered the exact sensation of the dark air filling with toxic white gas, my fingers desperately grasping for a safety override wheel that had been lubricated with liquid silicone so that it would slip out of my hands. My digital gas spectrometer began to emit a low, rhythmic beep every 10 seconds, indicating that the ambient carbon monoxide levels were normal, but climbing steadily as the primary furnace upstairs began its warm-up cycle. I stopped in front of the bypass station labeled Section 4B, pointing my thermal sensor at the heavy chrome flange where the liquid slurry line met the gaseous transport duct. "This valve looks newly polished," Desmond observed, his shoulder nearly brushing mine as he leaned in to look at the pressure reading. He was using a high-density digital camera to document every union and junction point along our inspection path. "The valve was replaced 18 days ago according to the ledger," I said, pointing the blue laser guide of my scanner directly at the hex bolts securing the high-pressure plate. "But notice the marking on the bolt head. It is a grade 5 steel connector, not the grade 8 alloy required by federal industrial regulations for high-density sulfur applications. Why would they use substandard connectors on a high-temperature assembly?" Desmond asked, his pencil moving rapidly over his waterproof clipboard. "A grade 5 bolt has a shear strength of exactly 85,000 pounds per square inch under normal atmospheric conditions," I said, my voice deadpan and steady. "But once the temperature in the surrounding casing reaches 340 degrees, that strength drops by more than 60% within 7 minutes. It is a very cheap way to ensure that a pressurized junction blows its seal completely under sudden load, while leaving absolutely no evidence of manual tampering. The fire will melt the bolts, and the investigators will simply conclude that the thermal regulation system had a catastrophic electronics failure." Desmond paused his writing, his dark blue eyes fixing on my face with a sharp, speculative intensity that made me wonder if he had seen through my disguise. You speak about this process as if you have personally witnessed a thermal failure in a grade 5 coupling before, he remarked. I grew up in the valley, I lied smoothly, pointing my scanner to the next joint. In this town you learn what melts and what holds before you learn how to balance a checkbook. We continued down the long corridor, the sound of our footsteps echoing off the wet concrete floor, where thin puddles of rusty drainage water reflected the red warning lights of the emergency exits. My knowledge of the past life timeline told me that Octavia Duchamp had already instructed the evening maintenance supervisor to disconnect the electronic alert triggers for the backup cooling system. But as I checked the high-tension junction box behind the central storage unit, my fingers encountered something that made the small hairs on my arms stand up like steel needles. The green LED light on the primary circuit panel was dark, but the jumper wire across Terminal 6 and 7 was completely missing. This was wrong. In my former life, they had kept the terminal bypassed with a physical copper clip, until the very night before the explosion to prevent any premature safety flags from showing on the central diagnostic boards in the manager's office. Now there was no wire, no clip, and no diagnostic reading whatsoever on the entire lower loop. I stood staring at the empty plastic housing, my fingers resting on the cold steel frame of the junction box as my brain frantically calculated the discrepancy. Why would they change the plan? Why was the manual override already removed a full 7 days before the planned catastrophe? The heavy concrete steps behind us groaned, and the dull, oily scent of wet hair gel and cheap imported cologne filtered into the damp corridor. Sebastian Ose stepped out of the shadow of the storage rack, his hands tucked deep into the pockets of his expensive, fleece-lined leather coat. He was smiling that thin, calculating smile that had once convinced my father that he was a genius who could be trusted with 50 years of Akibi family labor. "It is always cold in the cellar, is it not, Inspector?" Sebastian said, his eyes scanning my uniform and the silver identification badge pinned to my pocket. His eyes lingered on my cheekbones and the dark, thick frames of my glasses, but his expression remained completely blank. He had only ever seen his wife in expensive silk dresses, with her hair styled in soft curls and her spirit completely crushed by high-dosage sedatives. To him, the woman standing in front of him was nothing more than an anonymous bureaucrat sent by an insurance syndicate that he intended to swindle for millions. "We find the lower vaults provide the most accurate assessment of structural longevity, Mr. Osei," Desmond replied before I could speak, his tall frame stepping slightly to the side to block Sebastian's direct line of sight to my equipment bag. "Your wife's family built this substructure to withstand 3,000 tons of static loading, but our engineering office had some concerns about the dampness along the northern load walls." "My wife's family was very good at building monuments to their own vanity," Sebastian said, his tone dry and dripping with the arrogant dismissiveness I knew only too well. "But they had absolutely no understanding of modern logistical management. That is why they are no longer in control of the assets, and that is why I am currently renegotiating the entire security margin for this district." I kept my head lowered, pretending to adjust the digital screen on my testing unit while my ears strained to catch every syllable of his voice. In my previous life, that voice had spent 6 months telling me that I was losing my mind, that the hallucinations I was experiencing from the poisoned tea he brewed were the result of late-onset schizophrenia. Hearing him talk now, so clean and self-righteous, made the physical phantom scars on my back burn with a sharp, stabbing heat that felt like a white-hot metal bar being pressed into my flesh. "We would like to inspect the dry gas condensation room next," keeping my voice dropped into a gravelly, flat chest tone that sounded 30 years older than my actual age. "The humidity values in your manual ledger do not align with our baseline models for this geographic region." Sebastian chuckled, a low, wet sound that made my skin crawl under my canvas jacket. "You government inspectors are always looking for some tiny discrepancy in the margins to justify your expense reports. The condensation room is locked today because our head systems operator, Miss Duchamp, is currently running a thermal purge cycle. A thermal purge cycle is not permitted under the state clean air code during high-traffic weekday shifts," I said, my voice hardening just enough to make Desmond Thackeray turn his head to look at me. "It requires a 24-hour public notice if you are venting gaseous copper residue through the main scrubber stacks on a Monday." "I manage the schedule at this facility, Inspector," Sebastian said, his smile disappearing into a thin, straight line that revealed the vicious, petulant temper behind his elegant exterior. My office handles all the local compliance exceptions. If you want to argue about code violations, we can do it over a steak dinner in the executive suite with our county attorney, or you can finish your scanning and let my contractors do their work. I did not answer him. I simply picked up my leather gear case, looked at the digital readout on my main spectrometer, and walked right past him toward the green metal steps that led back to the central assembly yard. As soon as the cold, slate-colored light of the Pennsylvania afternoon hit my face again, I pulled my glove off and pressed my bare hand against the wet, cold brickwork of the main warehouse to stop my palm from trembling. The timing was wrong. If they were already running a thermal purge cycle on Monday morning, instead of waiting for next week, it meant they had accelerated the schedule, because they knew the insurance consortium was bringing in external investigators to do an on-site audit before the binding deadline. Sebastian Ozai had not bought a $500 million policy because he wanted to collect next month. He had bought it because he needed the cash infusion within 14 days to cover the massive embezzlement losses at his holding firm before the federal grand jury in Chicago convened. They are going to burn the plant today, I thought, my mind spinning like a high-speed centrifuge as my gaze fixed on the tall, gray venting stacks. They are going to do it while we are still inside, and they are going to frame the fire on an uncalibrated industrial thermometer that my regulatory agency supposedly cleared during this morning's walkthrough. Desmond Thackeray stepped up beside me, his long, heavy wool coat snapping in the freezing wind that was now blowing off Lake Erie. He was looking at his notebook, his dark brows knitted together in deep concentration. "He is too confident," Desmond muttered under his breath, his eyes fixed on the glass-fronted administrative suite, where Octavia Duchamp was now standing by the railing, watching us with a binoculars case over her shoulder. Sebastian Ozai is treating this $500 million transaction like it is a routine banking deposit. My department has handled over 70 industrial evaluations this year, and I have never seen a CFO who was so eager to show us his weakest components. He is showing us the weak components because he wants the official report to state that we observed the defect. I said, my fingers gripping the leather strap of my scanner until my knuckles turned as white as paper. He wants our insurance file to have a written, dated record of structural vulnerability that is entirely separate from his own maintenance team. If the underwriter signs off on a policy while knowing that a risk exists, the state courts in this jurisdiction cannot deny the claim based on pre-existing equipment failures. Desmond turned his head, his dark eyes looking at me with a sudden, sharp clarity that made my breath catch in my throat. "How do you know the Pennsylvania state court rules for insurance exclusion? That is specialized corporate jurisprudence, not field safety inspection training." I spent 4 years as a junior paralegal before I joined the inspection service. I lied again, though this time my heart was hammering so loudly I was certain he could hear it. I used to read the subrogation clauses in the back of the files when the office was quiet. He didn't say anything, but his eyes stayed on mine for a second longer than was strictly necessary for a professional associate. "We need to go back to the hotel and draft the temporary suspension order," he said, his hand reaching out to touch my sleeve, a brief, protective movement that felt incredibly warm against the freezing lake air. "If the values you scanned are accurate, this facility is a 500-acre bomb with a very short fuse. I will not have my staff inside the perimeter when those furnace chambers start their automated shift rotations tomorrow." "No," I said, looking him dead in the eye as the red light on my digital monitor began to pulse a fast, rhythmic alarm pattern. "We have exactly 60 minutes before the maintenance crew switches the pneumatic cooling loop to the dry cycle. If we leave this facility now, we will be leaving behind the only physical evidence of premeditated mass murder that this state will ever see." I pulled my heavy hazard hood back up over my face, zipped my canvas collar to the top, and turned back toward the main warehouse before Desmond Thackeray could pull out his car keys. The scent of sweet oil was gone, replaced now by the sharp, metallic tang of pressurized ammonia, leaking into the concrete ventilation channels from a point deep beneath the foundry floor. My second life had only lasted for 12 hours, and I was not about to spend the rest of it running from the same 2 people who had already turned me into ash once. The path to the primary ammonia compressor was blocked by 2 large, yellow warning signs that indicated active maintenance on the heavy sulfur scrubbers. I didn't care about the signs. I knew this building's skeleton because I'd watched my father sign the original architectural blueprints in our dining room when I was 14 years old. Underneath the main conveyor belts for the nickel scrap line, there was an old service utility tube that connected the heavy-medium separation plant directly to the primary valve room in the sub-basement. "Let us go," I whispered to Desmond, who was keeping pace with me despite the awkward weight of his camera and briefcase. "We need to access the main regulator before Octavia Duchamp manually resets the local telemetry loops in the main office." "How did you find this hatch?" Desmond asked, his voice low and tight as he crawled after me through the low, steel-framed concrete sleeve. "It is not listed on any of the fire exit plans our office received from the county record room. My father built these tunnels to allow the pipe fitters to escape if the central chemical lift ever jammed during an active power failure," I said, before I could stop myself from revealing my connection. He called them the safety seams. He believed that no industrial system was worth a single human fingernail, and he wanted his engineers to always have an emergency way out of the dark. "Your father was a very different man than Sebastian Ose," Desmond remarked, his voice echoing softly against the cold, damp concrete of the tunnel. His hand was holding my scanner case for me, his knuckles grazing mine as we crawled out into the narrow chamber, where the massive green iron castings of the compressor stood. The chamber was freezing, but the sound of the steam lines overhead was deafening, a high-pitched, screaming whistle that sounded like 20 locomotives trying to stop simultaneously on a wet track. The primary valve for the dry gas cooling manifold, labeled Sector 9A, sat in the center of the dark space, surrounded by a heavy metal cage that was secured with a heavy padlocked brass bar. I pointed my high-power flashlight at the lock, and my stomach turned cold when I saw the shiny, newly greased keyhole. It was not a standard security lock, it was a specialized industrial shutoff bolt that had been manually installed by Octavia's administrative order 2 days ago. Next to the valve, a large orange cylinder containing 90 gallons of commercial methyl ester stood on its steel frame, connected directly to the primary nitrogen cooling intake line by a series of thin copper tubes that had been hastily soldered by hand. "They are going to feed the flammable ester directly into the dry gas manifold during the scheduled power spike at 3 o'clock, I said, pointing my analyzer at the connection joints. "The resulting mixture will turn the entire steam network into an explosive gel that will ignite the moment the furnace operators turn on the ignition switches for the afternoon smelt. It will destroy everything within 4 city blocks, and the physical remnants of these thin copper pipes will look exactly like a natural pressure fuse failure to the state investigators." "We need to photograph this immediately," Desmond said, his digital camera already clicking in the dim, red-filtered emergency light of the chamber. "This is criminal sabotage of a public safety system under federal maritime transport rules. We can shut down this plant and freeze all their bank accounts within 45 minutes. We will not make it out of the gate in 45 minutes if they know we have this footage," I replied, my hands working quickly to open the digital connection box on the side of the main controller block. I had 3 small plastic data chips in my pocket, the same security monitors I had spent all my savings to buy before I left the hotel in Pittsburgh. I slid the chips directly into the slots on the main logic unit of the safety system, securing them behind the steel frame with heavy waterproof epoxy. "What are you doing?" Desmond asked, his hand coming down gently on mine, his touch warm and firm as he tried to stop my fingers from shaking. "That is not part of the standard underwriting verification. These are real-time, satellite-linked environmental data capture cards," I explained, looking him directly in the face, our faces so close I could see the small gray flecks in his dark blue eyes. "They will transmit the active chemical composition and pressure changes of the manifold directly to the State Regulatory Board and the Federal Marshal's Office in Erie every 5 seconds. Even if Sebastian and Octavia burn this whole warehouse to the ground and destroy every server on the property, the direct records of their intentional pressure manipulation will be sitting on an encrypted off-site government server in Philadelphia before the first fire engine even arrives at the gate." "You are not an insurance inspector," Desmond said softly, his voice remarkably calm given the screaming whistle of the steam line over our heads. His fingers did not let go of my wrist, but his grip was no longer restrictive. It felt steadying, like an anchor in a rising lake tide. "I have seen the credential register for the regional office. There is no lead inspector named Imogen Akebi listed on our roster for the Great Lakes sector." "My real name is Imogen Akebi," I said, looking at him through the salt-encrusted plastic of my safety glasses. I was the wife of Sebastian Osei, and I was the daughter of the man who laid these floor bricks 50 years ago. He believes I am currently lying sedated in a locked bedroom in Maine, and he spent the last 6 months of our marriage preparing my death certificate so he could use my inheritance to save his mistress's shipping business. If you want to run out that gate and report me to the state licensing authority, you are welcome to do so, Mr. Thackeray. But if you want to save the lives of those 30 workers who are about to enter this plant for the afternoon shift, you will let me finish this circuit. Desmond stared at me for 3 very long, silent seconds, his breath rising in pale, gray clouds in the freezing cold room. His hand slowly slipped down my arm, his long fingers curling around the heavy wrench in my tool belt. "Tell me which valve needs to be locked open first," he said, his voice flat, determined, and entirely devoid of fear. "I have an undergraduate degree in mechanical infrastructure from Boston, and I can turn a flange faster than any of these pencil pushers upstairs." The immediate loop had intersected with our shared survival, and for the first time in 2 lives, I realized I did not have to bleed alone in the dark. We spent 20 minutes securing the secondary safety releases along the central ammonia pipe. I adjusted the digital calibration settings so that any sudden, manual change in the nitrogen flow rate would immediately sound the high-pitched emergency sirens in all 12 buildings across the manufacturing site, giving the smelter crews ample time to reach the safety assembly zones before any flammable mixture could reach the central furnace area. By the time we crawled back through the steel escape tube and stepped onto the loading deck behind Warehouse 3, the snow was falling heavily, big thick flakes that melted instantly when they touched the hot iron casing of the slag lines. My body was shivering from the deep dampness of the tunnels, but my eyes were perfectly dry. Just as we reached the asphalt walk near the main offices, the thick security door clicked open, and Octavia Duchamp stepped out into the falling snow, wearing her heavy, black designer boots and a bright red wool scarf. She looked directly at us, her slender fingers tapped a white rhythm against the glass bottle of imported sparkling water she was holding in her gloved hand. "Our compliance paperwork was sent to your office's central portal 20 minutes ago, Mr. Thackeray," she said, her voice high and clear, like a bell on a frozen morning. "Sebastian was very clear that we have a flight to catch at 5:45. If your inspector is finished counting bolts in our basement, we would like you to sign the preliminary binding clearance before the courthouse closes. Your paperwork is currently missing the municipal sewer district safety clearance for the copper discharge pool," Desmond replied, his face expressionless and professional as he pulled his heavy tablet out from his coat. "The county code requires an on-site testing certificate signed by a credentialed hydrologist before we can bind a $500 million casualty policy." Sebastian Osei appeared behind her in the doorway, his leather gloves already pulled tight over his fingers. He had a heavy black leather document bag under his arm, his movements hurried, and his jaw muscles visibly tight beneath his trim beard. "The county water district has been closed since noon because of the lake blizzard," Sebastian said, his eyes scanning my figure with a growing look of impatient suspicion that made my chest constrict. "I have our mayor's personal mobile number if you need a direct clearance, Thackeray. We are not delaying an international policy bind over a trivial administrative rubber stamp in Erie. My inspector was unable to run the thermal validation tests on the dry condensation vault because you had it marked for a cleaning cycle," Desmond said, his pen drawing a neat black mark through the primary sign-off block on his tablet screen. "Under the provisions of the Great Horizon Lloyd's policy book, we cannot execute the binding phase if there are outstanding temperature audits in the lower pressure chambers." Sebastian took 3 slow, aggressive steps toward us, his boots crunching in the new snow. His face had gone red, the elegant corporate mask beginning to crack to reveal the cruel, violent speculator who had once left me on the floor of our library to listen to my own ribs cracking after I questioned his business loans. "This is my facility, Inspector," Sebastian hissed, his finger pointing directly at my chest, his glove almost touching the wet canvas of my jacket. "I paid $30,000 to your regional supervisor to ensure that this safety file would be cleared on Monday afternoon. If you two don't sign the digital portal signature by 3 o'clock, I will have your credentials revoked for professional extortion before the day is over." "You paid our supervisor?" Desmond said, his dark blue eyes narrowing down into 2 cold slits of steel blue ice. "My camera was already recording, and my high-gain microphone has a direct fiber connection to our legal offices in Cleveland, Mr. Osei." That particular admission of private administrative bribery is already on our underwriter server. Sebastian paused, his face turning an oily shade of gray under his expensive wool collar. He looked at Desmond, then looked down at my scanner, then back at my eyes. For a split second, his pupils dilated with a sudden, horrible recognition that made him drop his heavy document bag into the cold mud of the pathway. "Your eyes," Sebastian muttered, his voice dropping into a shaky, thin whisper that was instantly swallowed by the lakeside wind. "No, that is not possible. My wife is under locked sedation at the institution in Maine. I spoke with her doctor on the telephone this morning at 9 o'clock. Your doctor is currently on a private plane to Montreal using your credit card." "Sebastian," I said, keeping my voice cold, distinct and speaking in my natural, sharp-edged home voice that I had used since a little girl in this very factory yard. But the administrative nurses at the clinic were far more interested in the $100,000 cash transfers I made from your holding account to their payroll box yesterday morning. They released me at 6 p.m. last night, and they signed the full voluntary medical disclosure affidavit for the state police before I left the county line. Sebastian stared at me, his body shaking so hard his leather document case slipped from his arm, spilling a thick stack of blue corporate securities certificates into the gray slush around his boots. "Imogen?" Octavia Duchamp whispered from the doorway, her hands flying to her red wool scarf as her pale face turned completely white. "No, you were dead. You were supposed to be locked up. You couldn't even walk to the window." The 30 workers for the afternoon smelt shift began to walk past us in their high-voltage protective suits and yellow hard hats, their loud laughter and heavy rubber boots echoing through the cold air. They stopped in their tracks when they saw the three of us standing in the slush, with the facility owner and his chief coordinator staring at an anonymous safety inspector, as if she were a ghost returned from the deepest level of the furnace vault. "You need to get these men out of here," Sebastian said, his fingers reaching out to grab Octavia's arm as he took a wild step backward toward the security office. "This plant is under active emergency pressure manipulation. We have a gas valve leak in Section 4B. We need to leave the perimeter immediately." He didn't care about the workers. He thought the copper piping bypass he had ordered Octavia to install was still going to trigger the 500-gallon explosion at 3 o'clock. And he wanted to clear the gate before the main blast incinerated his remaining liabilities. "There isn't gas valve leak," Sebastian, I said, taking 2 slow, heavy steps toward him, my body feeling lighter than it had in 2 lifetimes. "I disabled your manual methyl ester connection 20 minutes ago. Your nitrogen pressure loops have been fully calibrated to our automated security reporting systems, and our company safety alert was sent directly to the United States Department of Justice, the Securities and Exchange Commission, and the Pennsylvania State Police 3 minutes ago." Before Sebastian Ose could turn to run toward his black town car, the sharp, deafening whoop of the facility's high-decibel warning sirens began to echo from all 12 steel buildings across the factory campus. The orange alarm beacons along the main fence lines began to spin, their rhythmic red and blue lights cutting through the heavy lakeside snowfall with an icy, unforgiving glare. At the end of the entry road, 4 black utility vehicles with federal regulatory plates and flashing emergency lights rolled silently through the security gate, blocking Sebastian's vehicle with a diagonal wall of reinforced steel bumper guards. 6 federal marshals in heavy tactical hazard suits and badges stepped out into the falling snow, their high-powered lights trained directly on Sebastian Ose and Octavia Duchamp. "Your insurance application is officially declined for fraud, Mr. Ose," Desmond Thackeray said, his voice flat, clear, and perfectly steady as he reached out to click his digital pen shut. "We have already notified the exchange in Chicago that all global assets belonging to Ose Holding and Duchamp Logistics have been frozen under the Interstate Security and Fraud Act." Sebastian dropped his head into his leather gloves, his body slumping down onto the wet steps of the main office like a discarded, unthreaded bolt. Next to him, Octavia Duchamp began to scream at the federal marshals, her expensive ivory coat getting soaked in the oily, dirty runoff of the nickel foundry as 2 officers pulled her arms behind her back with a metallic, decisive snap of steel handcuffs. I stood in the cold wind, the big white flakes of snow settling on my bare skin, but I did not feel the phantom fire anymore. The heat was gone, replaced by a deep, beautiful coolness that filled my chest like a long draught of clean winter water. I looked back at the giant silver furnaces where my father's old company name was still faintly visible under 40 years of heavy industrial soot. Desmond Thackeray stepped up beside me, his long, heavy wool coat brushing against mine as he looked down at the dark, frozen valley of the plant. The underwriters have decided to place this entire industrial asset into temporary administrative receivership, while your estate works out the family inheritance recovery papers in the court system, he said, his hand sliding into his pocket to pull out a small, warm plastic cup of black coffee from his car's thermo flask. He offered it to me with a silent, quiet look of respect that made my heart feel more settled than any of my old doctors had ever managed. "Do you think you can manage 30 smelting furnaces in the spring, Imogen?" he asked, a small, dark corner of his mouth curving up into a very faint, appreciative smile. "We will need to replace all those grade 5 bolts with proper nickel alloy studs before the March warming," I replied, taking the coffee and holding it in both hands, letting the warm steam rise to meet the freezing lakeside air. "And we are going to need a very thorough legal team to clean up the corporate registry before our first shipments of refined alloy leave for the shipyards in Philadelphia." He nodded once, his shoulder steady and firm against mine as we turned together and began our long, quiet walk back toward the main gate, our boots leaving a single, deep set of parallel tracks in the new snow behind us. Did she go far enough, or was she still too merciful? Comment justice if the ending was perfect. Comment harder if you wanted an even colder revenge. Your comments decide how ruthless the next ending should be. Like and subscribe if you want to be here for the next story.